Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the New Deal recorded lecture. And so in part one, we talked about a lot of the alphabet agencies and um, really the success of the first 100 days that FDR had into office. And so we also talked about the the three categories that each of these New Deal programs fit in: relief, recovery, and reform. And so relief is immediate aid to try to help those to keep from going under and foreclosure on their homes. Recovery is designed to get the country out of the Great Depression. Reform is designed to prevent it from another Great Depression and have long-term action and so forth. Now, not everybody was happy with the New Deal. A lot of the poor people were happy, but FDR actually got attacked from the left and the right. So from the left, he got attacked for not going far enough. And we're going to talk about some of those critics here in just a minute with Father Charles Conklin, and also a medical doctor in California who attacked him and actually came up with the idea of Social Security, as well as Huey Long. And then on the right side, critics, particularly who attacked the TVA, said it was socialistic and said it did too much. And that it took away from free enterprise and whatnot. So let's look at what ends up happening. Now, basically, they thought that critics on the right thought that he was a traitor to his economic class. And so in 1934, Republican business leaders joined the conservative Democrats in a Liberty League that lobbied against the reckless spending and socialist reforms of the New Deal. And so they felt like it violated laissez-faire. Plus, the Supreme Court wasn't entirely on board as well because they struck down both the AAA and the NIRA as unconstitutional. And so also one of the things that as well is they declared a Railroad Retirement Act unconstitutional and the Franzier-Lemke Debt Relief Act as unconstitutional as well. So let's look at some of the critics. Father Charles Conklin, who was a Catholic priest in the Detroit area, is going to criticize FDR and said he should nationalize all banks. Dr. Francis Townsend is a California doctor that argued that the United States should give an old age pension to retirees so that way they could retire, get out of the job market, and open up people in the middle age to be able to advance. Al Smith, another Democrat who felt like he had kind of gone too far. And then Huey Long was a kind of a radical congressman from Louisiana who I'll cover in just a minute. They called Kingfish. And one of the things that the New Deal had to do is that it deficit spend. They went instead of gold and silver coinage to paper money. So that way the government can print more paper money and then pay their workers in paper money. And that's how you can deficit spend. And we technically do all that all the way to today. Now, Nixon is the one who officially took the U.S. off the gold standard and so forth. So critics said it was a welfare state and it created a population who relied too much on the federal government. Now let's look at its successes. Okay. It did stimulate the economy. Okay. The unemployment rate is going to go down some. It doesn't get the country out of the Great Depression until World War II. It did put many Americans back to work. It helped restore self-confidence and also kind of boosted the morale of a lot of poor people. And the government is forever going to change and be more directly involved in the people. And that's going to continue all the way to present day. But remember, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. That is World War II. Okay. So kind of give you the idea of political spectrum and so forth. So let's look at Dr. Francis Townsend first, who I'll show you a picture of in just a minute. He proposed in 1933 this old age revolving pension plan that would give about $200 a month, which is about $3,000 a month today, to citizens over the age of 60. To receive payments, the elderly would have to retire from their jobs, thus opening their positions to younger workers, and agree to spend the money within a month. So my grandmother was on Social Security for a long time in her life because she lived to be 100. This plan gained wide support in the West and influenced the passing of the Social Security Act of 1935. So Roosevelt does listen to Dr. Francis Townsend. Now, Father Charles Conklin, the guy on the left, he also challenged Roosevelt's leadership and attracted a large following, especially in the Midwest. Conklin was a Catholic priest in Detroit who had a radio program that attracted about 40 million listeners by 1933. Conklin initially supported the New Deal, but turned against it when Roosevelt refused to nationalize the banking system and expand the money supply. But Charles Conklin was also anti-Semitic, which means he doesn't like Jews. He attacked FDR throughout the Great Depression, but really the biggest threat to FDR came from Huey Long, because FDR saw that he could kind of prey on the poor and convince them that he could do a lot of things, much like some, Communist Party leaders in other countries and so forth. So why was Huey Long so popular? He had been a senator and a former governor of Louisiana. He actually is going to try to run for president, would have ran for president in 1936 to upend FDR, but actually gets assassinated. The reason why he was popular in Louisiana is because he had helped lower utility bills, and he also increased taxes on corporations. He built new highways, bridges, hospitals, and schools. So all that sounds great. Here's where the craziness comes in. He had this plan called the Share Our Wealth Society, which had about 4 million followers. And what he advocated is redistribution of wealth. He kind of like a Robin Hood. You rob from the rich and give to the poor. He advocated a tax of 100% of all income over $1 million and all inheritance over $5 million. Now, he promised to make every man a king, which is why they called him Kingfish. The problem is, even if you seized all that wealth of the wealthiest Americans, it still wouldn't have given all these poor people he promised the amount of money with one-time thing. And so basically, he was kind of promoting even a more radical form of socialism and really communism to a certain extent. But he gets assassinated in Louisiana in 1935. Charles Coughlin was probably the second most popular of these three. So I think we know what socialism is. It's an economic system based on cooperation rather than competition. The government owns the business and capital and so forth, and they control production. Here's Francis Townsend, who's an older man, so it makes sense that he wanted the old age pension. And Social Security is still around today. All right, let's look at the Second New Deal. So in his first term, he primarily passed all the stuff we covered in part one. In the last 2 years of his second term, his first term, he passes what they call the Second New Deal. Not quite as popular, but has some things that we still have around today, like Social Security. So because of the criticism, FDR even went further left on the political spectrum than he had before. He passed the Revenue Act of 1935 that proposed a substantial tax increase on corporate profits and higher income and estate taxes on wealthy citizens. That was influenced by Huey Long. Didn't go as far as Huey Long, but was influenced by that. Congress ended up moderating its rates, so it boosted revenue only by about $250 million a year. And so let's look at the Wagner Act. This is one of the most popular things for the labor movement, if not the most popular of the New Deal, because what it did, it upheld the right of industrial workers to join unions. So it made unions completely legal. And because of the opposition of Southern Democrats who represent the interests of planters and landlords, it did not apply to farm workers. Okay, the act, so it didn't help tenant farmers. The act outlawed many practices used by employers to squelch unions, such as firing workers for organizing activities. It also established a National Labor Relations Board, a federal agency with the authority to protect workers from employer coercion, supervise elections from union representation, and guarantee the process of collective bargaining. Now, the Social Security Act, what this did was passed in 1935. It provided retirement pensions, unemployment insurance, aid to blind, deaf, disabled, and dependent children. Okay, Social Security Act does a lot of things. We know it because of the retirement pensions, but really, like if you're ever laid off, you would go to the Social Security office for unemployment insurance. Okay, and so forth. All right, the WPA, which I actually did my master's thesis research on, what this does is the WPA employed about 8.5 million workers. A lot of it was construction, but a lot of it was people that were typically white-collar jobs that had trouble getting work, like if you're an artist, if you're a musician, if you're an actor, if you're a writer, all of those things, how are you going to find work and so forth? And so it employed them. The WPA built, for the construction side of it, built about 2,500 hospitals, 5,900 schools, 13,000 playgrounds, and a lot of public buildings. It also established 8,192 parks, which is awesome, and 853 small airports. Okay, and so the WPA was wide-reaching. It ends with World War II because it wasn't necessary once World War II came around for unemployment. Here's an artist literally painting people making a sidewalk, which critics like. That's painting somebody to do nothing of any value. But nonetheless, it gave artists work. Here's another sewage, so creating internal plumbing and so forth. Okay, here's another construction project. Here is trying to stop soil erosion by putting rocks on the side. We see this a lot in the Rocky Mountains. So let's look at the 1936 election. Kansas Governor Alfred M. Landon ran on the Republican ticket, and he pushed for less spending and socialistic New Deal legislation. So he didn't like the socialistic New Deal. The 1936 election was made notable by the bitter class struggle between the poor and the rich. So the rich oftentimes would support Landon, the poor supported FDR. Roosevelt won easily with the Republicans only carrying 2 states, so he actually won by a bigger margin than he did in 1932. And so Democrats also claimed 2/3 of the seats in the House and the Senate. But what ends up happening is there's going to be a sharp recession in his first year in his second term. Now, what happens with that is as the economy is improving, the Congress wanted to have less deficit spending, so they reduced spending. And what happens is when they reduce that spending, a lot of the economy was dependent on federal government spending. You had a double dip recession, which means things are improving from a recession, and then it goes back down again. And let's look at the Supreme Court problems. And so really, after the New Deal programs were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935, was Social Security, TVA, and the Wagner Act were all about to be heard by the Supreme Court. FDR feared that they would strike those as unconstitutional as well, and those are very big and important programs that he had passed. So what he did is he proposed adding a new justice for every member over the age of 70, and this was called a court packing scheme, and it was one of the dumbest things FDR ever did as president. Because it backfired. Congress not only bashed it, but the public are like, whoa, don't jack with the Supreme Court. And so after that, Congress did not pass near the many New Deal legislations that they had before. But what's interesting is what ends up happening. The Supreme Court decides to not strike any more of the New Deal program as unconstitutional. So even though he lost the battle by looking bad in public relations and not getting other New Deal legislations passed, he wins the long-term conflict because the Supreme Court doesn't declare anything else unconstitutional from the New Deal besides the AAA and the NRA and so forth. So the Schechter versus United States case is a Supreme Court case that ruled the NIRA as unconstitutional, and it was really dealing with a poultry code and so forth. And so if you ever take a government class, you'll investigate the Schechter versus U.S. case. And so the court packing scheme made Roosevelt look like he was trying to gain too much power and make him look like he was power hungry. Now, I've talked about the Roosevelt recession because they cut federal spending. So the WPA's funding is cut in half. We had about 1.5 million workers get laid off because there's less money to hire them from government spending. The Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates, so it was much more difficult to get a loan and so forth. And you look right here. So right here in the middle is where this double dip recession, boom, unemployment jumps back up. And then you notice, boom, it starts going down. The real reason why it goes down, okay, is because of World War II beginning in 1939 with Germany invading Poland, also Soviet Union invading Poland, Britain and France go to war. They're going to need to buy a bunch of war materials. Also, China had been invaded in 1937. And so they are going to be buying American manufacturers as well. And so we'll look at some other things. We get to the World War II recorded lecture because the federal government is going to try to do some things to remain isolated and so forth. So we talked about Keynesian economics in part one. What that is it's a British economist advocated that in a time of crisis, okay, only in a time of crisis, you deficit spend your way out of the economic depression. And so he would not have favored us doing this past World War II, but nonetheless, we do it anyway. All right. Let's look at the New Deal's impact on society and so forth. The New Deal did not, as I mentioned, end the Great Depression. Okay, World War II did. Okay, but as I mentioned, it does keep us from socialism and did help preserve capitalism and democracy. Okay, so the results of it is the number of federal employees increased 80% through 1940. Whoa. Okay, so federal government's the largest employer in the country at that time and still today. Hoover spent $3.1 billion in 1930 with a surplus of $1 billion, while FDR spent $9.4 billion in 1939 with a deficit of $3 billion. So Hoover, more responsible fiscally. FDR spent more money, but was much more popular with his spending and so forth. Now, you also have the rise of labor as a result of the Wagner Act. So really, one of the groups that benefited tremendously from the New Deal was organized workers. The Congress of Industrial Workers, which they are unskilled laborers, while the AFL is skilled. They organize all the workers in the industry, both skilled and unskilled, into one union. So the AFL and the CIO joined forces and merged. Okay. Now the CIO, that actually doesn't have, they don't merge till later in history, then they break up and then they get back together, kind of like a high school relationship. But the CIO held a sit-down strike at General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, which has gained notoriety recently because of its terrible water supply. But they did a sit-down strike in 1936. The workers lived in the factories and machine shops for 44 days before General Motors recognized their union, the United Automobile Workers, which was part of the CIO. Shortly thereafter, the CIO won another major victory at the U.S. Steel Corporation. They recognized the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, and in March of 1937, a total of 167,210 workers staged 170 sit-down strikes. Whoa! Labor unions called nearly 5,000 strikes that year and won favorable terms in 80% of them. Most middle-class Americans opposed the sit-down tactics, and in 1939, the Supreme Court accepted this argument and upheld a law that banned the sit-down tactic. The CIO also organized and accepted African Americans, and something the AFL would not do. The CIO also gave $770,000, about $12 million today, to Democratic campaigns in 1936 because FDR was supporting the labor movement, and its political action committee became a major Democratic contributor during the 1940s. Despite its success during the 1930s, the labor movement did not develop into a dominant force in American life. FDR never made the growth of the labor movement a high priority, and many workers remained suspicious of unionization, especially as New Deal programs provided unemployment assistance and pension benefits. So they didn't have to join a union to get those benefits from the New Deal programs. Now we're going to come back to women and blacks and the New Deal in part 3.